Hello, this is Dr. S. Monker, and welcome to our discussion today of the 1980s. So, we are now moving into the decade in which I was born. So, as we get a little bit closer to present, it's going to be a little surreal. But I am an old millennial, so born at the beginning of the 80s. So, most of this I don't remember. Once we get into the 90s, then it's going to be a little bit more surreal for me to cover this material. So today we're going to talk all about Ronald Reagan. We're going to talk about his presidency. We're going to talk about what we call the Reagan Revolution. In other words, this conservative movement that we talked about last session, starting at the local level, moving up to the state, finally going national with the election of Ronald Reagan. And digging a little bit more into Reagan's policies and discussing a little bit Ronald Reagan's legacies, because Ronald Reagan is one of those presidents whose influence and image looms very large in the public consciousness, much like John F. Kennedy's, who we talked about earlier. And really, we kind of want to dig into separating kind of the man, the myth, and the legend, if it were. So let's talk a little bit about Ronald Reagan. We're going to talk about economics. We're going to talk about Cold War. And yes, we're going to talk about yuppies. So let's dive in. All right. So last session, we talked about how Ronald Reagan, riding this wave of increasing social and political conservatism in the 70s, will win the election of 1980 over Jimmy Carter, who was a one-term Democratic president who had a lot of similar economic policies to Ronald Reagan, but because he wasn't a Republican, didn't really get a lot of recognition for the things that Reagan will be lauded for. So Ronald Reagan is probably best remembered as a president for his economic policies. Remember, that's one of his campaign goals, is to fix the American economy, which had been really struggling since the early 1970s with stagnant economic growth or active decline and a rising inflation. So Ronald Reagan is going to try to fix that with his economic policies, which we'll talk more about in detail in a second. He also is a diehard Cold Warrior. Reagan basically comes in wanting to hit the Soviet Union while they're weak. We'll talk a little bit about how the Soviet Union is experiencing some changes and some problems in their economy and social life as well that do make them more vulnerable. So Reagan is right to kind of hit them on those points of vulnerability. Really, Ronald Reagan, though, demonstrates as a president the importance of messaging. This is where politics begins to become much more hyper partisan. We're going to see that especially the tail end of today when we talk about the election of 1988. It's going to get a lot more personally ugly. So really a lot of the origins of the hyper-partisan nature of politics, of talking about like us versus them, really starts to come in politics in the 1980s, which probably it's not attributed just to Reagan, right? But definitely we see it expressed more during Reagan's time in office. But Reagan, for all of his focus on the issues that the conservative movement cared about, was a pragmatist. He recognized that there were some things that were achievable within the conservative movement. So, say, for example, more conservative economic policies or less government regulation, but that there were other things that were a little more touchy to accomplish politically, particularly when it comes to a little bit more social policies, in which he recognized that in order to kind of get what he saw as the more important priority, the economy, he would have to compromise with Democrats and others on things that were lower on the priority list for him, like social issues. Reagan's really going to focus heavily on the economy. In fact, the focus of Reagan on the economy and on fixing the American economy is going to give the nickname Reaganomics to his economic policies. And really, what we're going to see during Reagan's time in office is Reagan is going to change around definitions of economic freedom. So throughout US history since 1877, we've been talking about economic freedom, meaning the ability of people to earn a livelihood, right, to achieve at least a basic standard of living, to have some concept of downtime. So usually when we've been talking about economic freedom, we've been more focusing on that definition as coming from the working class, from labor unions, right, equality of condition. So Reagan takes economic freedom and spins it in a new direction. He talks about economic freedom as more describing a freedom of business and the economy. So for him, economic freedom is businesses' ability to do business with as little regulation as possible. So that meant deregulating government supervision over the economy, reducing taxes on businesses, and trying to disempower labor unions, who businesses oftentimes saw as an obstacle to them being able to conduct business the way they wanted to. So in many ways, this is an echo of earlier in the century, when we talk about things like liberty of contract, right? The ability of businesses to do business as they see fit. This is a return, right, to the late 1800s and early 1900s conception of economic freedom. So Reagan is going to institute a number of tax reforms during his time in office, working with Congress. And what we're really going to see most drastically in terms of changes in the tax code is changes to the top tax bracket. So the people who are earning the most money in American society. In 1981, they were paying half of their income, 50% in taxes. So they were taxed at 50% rate. Now, that's not the highest it had ever been. The highest tax rate on the wealthiest income bracket in the United States historically at its highest point was 70%, 70. 50% is still pretty high. And by the time Reagan leaves office, it's dropped down to about 28%, which is roughly where it is today in terms of the top income bracket. So high income earners are only paying about less than a third percent of their income to taxes. And Reagan argued that cutting taxes on the wealthy was necessary to generate economic growth. And this is part of what's called supply side economics. This also gets the popular nickname of trickle-down economics because of how it's supposed to work. So according to supply side or trickle-down economics, if you cut taxes on rich people and if you cut taxes on businesses, the idea was that they would take the savings, right, the money that they're no longer having to pay to taxes, and invest it in growing their businesses, in growing business ventures if they're private individuals, and that investing in their companies and their industries would mean more growth economically for those lower down in income status, because if they're investing in their company and they're growing, that means more jobs, right? That means more job opportunities for people in the middle and the lower class. So that was the idea, was that people were going to take this money that they had saved and reinvest in the economy and therefore benefit people lower down. They also believed that it would motivate economic growth by giving people more incentive to work hard for their money, since they now get to keep more of it, right? They have to pay less to taxes. Now, these changes aren't going to be effective immediately. No economic change usually has big results overnight. And in fact, we're going to see a little bit of a recession during Reagan's initial year in office from 1981 to 1982. However, after that, we're going to start to see the economy slowly rebound. The inflation rate is going to drop from 13.5% in 1981 to 3.5% in 1988. That's a great news for the American people and the American economy. It means the American economy is more stable. It's no longer flatlining. It's now starting to bounce back. These changes in tax law in the United States and the supply side economics did result in what many historians have nicknamed the Second Gilded Age, very reminiscent of the time period 100 years ago, the First Gilded Age, in which the top 1% of Americans experienced profound growth in wealth. In the 1980s, the top 1% of Americans owned 40% of all wealth in the United States, which was double the amount of wealth share that they had occupied in 1960. And where are people making their money? Not only are they having to pay less taxes, but there's also this trend of making money through corporate mergers and sales. Now, buying and selling businesses is not in and of itself long term usually an economic gain. Where the money is being made is by the people who are negotiating those sales and mergers. So, in other words, people working in law and finance who are cutting these deals are the ones making a lot of money. Sometimes these sales and mergers make sense, people working in the same industry, right? Similar companies merging or selling off divisions that don't make sense in your broader company portfolio. Sometimes they make a little less logical sense. For example, Nabisco and RJ Reynolds Tobacco Company merged in 1988. And that merger, although it seems a little weird, right? Cookies and tobacco, that merger netted $1 billion in fees. Okay? So the people negotiating this merger made $1 billion. And usually that's where the money is to be made, is in selling and consolidating, not actually running these new companies that had been sold off or acquired. So really just the act of buying and selling was more profitable than running a lot of these companies. So again, making lots of money for the people owning these companies or the people negotiating these mergers and sales, but that's not translating into stability or profit for the people actually working at those companies that are being sold or merged. Now, people working in law and finance who are benefiting from this business culture in the 1980s get the nickname yuppies, which is short for young urban professionals. And yuppies tended to work in areas of the economy like finance, which is still a pretty big sector in the American economy today. And yuppies, rather than investing their money in business or employing other Americans, tended to spend their money on consumer goods. There is a real book called The Yuppie Handbook, which is a work of satire, but it really does exist. You can buy it on any kind of book website like Amazon. Satirized the yuppie. It was a field guide for you to kind of spot yuppies and understand them. So it's a satire through sort of an anthropological lens, a guide to yuppies. So one of the things that if you look this cover up on Amazon, the Yuppie Handbook, is that yuppies wore designer clothing from labels like Ralph Lauren, Burberry, Gucci, Coach. They patronized companies like Cartier for watches. They played sports like squash, which think of it as kind of like a tennis racquetball. It's in the same family, but again, usually not played by poor people. They bought the latest technology. So Sony Walkmans are super hot in the 1980s as a way to listen to music on headphones portably, right? Not be attached by cords. And you can see the yuppie archetype in action if you've ever seen the popular holiday movie National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation. If you've ever seen that film, the neighbors, Todd and Margot, are textbook yuppies, okay, through their participation in fitness trends, which are continue to be popular in the 80s, all of the electronics that they have, the way their house is designed. They're really textbook classes of yuppies. So for people in the American elite, this is a time of great prosperity. But much like the first Gilded Age, that prosperity does not extend all across the board to all social classes. In fact, economics are getting worse for working class Americans because the process of deindustrialization, or this loss of manufacturing economy in the United States, continues into the 1980s. Deindustrialization meant that the poorest of the working class in the United States had reduced incomes. For many people, for a long period of time, factory jobs had been the way forward to economic stability. If you were in the lower class, if you didn't have the opportunity to go to college, you could still make a livelihood working in a factory. Now that is no longer available to them. Minorities were disproportionately affected by factory closures, as they had only recently started to make gains in manufacturing jobs. And more jobs in the 1980s are shifting away from manufacturing type economy to a more service and information driven economy. And in the information driven economy, where more of the better paying jobs were, those jobs tended to require higher levels of education, college degrees. So this is also going to factor in too, is that you have to find some way to pay for college. So the reality was that the poorest members of the American working class, and even those into the lower middle class, really saw reduced or stagnated incomes in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan made good on his promise to minimize the power of unions. Nowhere do we see this more than the air traffic controller strike in 1981. 13,000 members of the Air Traffic Controllers Union went on strike. Now, according to federal law, if you work in certain essential occupations, and this includes air traffic controllers, right? They're the ones who make sure that your planes don't collide in midair, then you're not allowed to strike. Similarly, you can't strike if you're a firefighter, a policeman, etc. So they go on strike in violation of federal law. And Reagan had warned them when they were talking about strike that if they went on strike illegally, they would all be fired. And in fact, that's what happened. All 13,000 union members were fired, and Ronald Reagan deployed the military to take over air traffic controller duties at airports across the United States until they could find, train, and hire new air traffic controllers. Okay. This wins Reagan a lot of positive press, especially within conservative circles. And we're going to see, due to a combination of declining manufacturing and then public pushes against unions like the air traffic controller unions, union membership drops to about 11% outside of government workers, one of the lowest levels that had been in American history. We're also going to see a decline of public services, as many state and local governments don't have a lot of revenue, again, because taxes are cut. This is great for the people who don't have to pay as much taxes, but that also means less government funding is available for public services. So we see a spike in the homelessness rate as we see cuts to welfare programs, mental health assistance, public housing programs who have their budgets slashed because of this decline in revenue, and because oftentimes conservatives disagreed with how to administer these programs. And the unemployment rate at the beginning of the 1980s was still fairly high. In 1981, it was 8.9% for the overall population. But if you look at subsets of the population, for example, African Americans, the unemployment rate was more than double at 20%. While the unemployment rate overall will improve in the 1980s, it will still disproportionately be higher among the working class population than the average general unemployment rate. Now, as I mentioned, Ronald Reagan is a pragmatist. Okay, he's going to be real about making sure he can accomplish his highest priorities, which are things like the Cold War and the economy. So for Reagan, his social policies are never going to be as conservative as the social conservatives who elected him probably would have liked. As far as civil rights, Reagan does dial down the level of federal enforcement, making sure that states abide by civil rights laws, but the Supreme Court continues to uphold affirmative action and other pro-civil rights policies in court cases throughout the 1980s. One of the platforms for Reagan's wife, Nancy, as the First Lady, was the Just Say No campaign, which tried to curtail the spread of drugs, particularly crack cocaine is a very big problem in urban areas in the 1980s. So this was trying to pitch kids that they shouldn't try drugs, right? Just say no, don't get there. But the Just Say No campaign doesn't really address the reason that drugs are oftentimes a problem, or the fact that in arresting and convicting people for possession and sale of drugs, there's a disproportionate representation of minorities in the war on drugs. This had started during Nixon's time in office as the drug problem in American cities increased. What we're going to see is that police are going to spend much more time focusing on drug issues in urban areas and in communities of color than they will in suburban and predominantly whiter areas, meaning that they're going after the people consuming, say, crack cocaine, which is a lower class drug, than they are white people shooting up heroin or having the powdered cocaine. So that's going to mean, and we're going to talk about this more as we get into the 90s and the early 2000s, that the prison population in the United States is going to start to become much more heavily populated by minorities disproportionately to their percentages in the general population. Now, Reagan does cut some funding to social programs like food stamps and low-income housing, but he knows that there are some things that really wouldn't fly. For example, Reagan will not make cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security, which greatly disappoints a lot of small government conservatives. And he also is not as conservative in his attitudes towards women as many social conservatives had hoped for either.